Hey everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 7, where we're going to focus on juveniles and gangs. So gangs have always existed, but there's been more law enforcement attention that has been devoted to gang and gang intervention issues for four main reasons. The first is that there has been an increase in the emergence of gangs in rural and suburban areas. Once upon a time, gangs were largely limited to urban locations, but that has proliferated into rural and suburban locations as well. There's also been an increased level of violence within gangs. And within that increase of violence, we've seen an increase of firearms violence. So that has also garnered a lot of law enforcement attention. And finally, there's been a massive increase in both drug use and drug trafficking among gangs, which has all four of these factors have worked together to result in greater attention from law enforcement. So one of the things about talking about gangs that's always been really difficult is how do we define a gang? It's a very general, nebulous term, and there are not super strict boundaries about what constitutes a gang versus what doesn't. So is 4 people a gang or 10 people a gang? Do you need 20? How many people do you need for it to be a gang, right? So it's always been really hard to define, but the working definition that we're going to use is a group of people working together towards unlawful ends with a strong adolescent component. In fact, the majority of them are going to be adolescent. There will be some who are of legal age and older, some well into their 20s. Very rarely will you see people in their 30s still partaking. They might still be affiliated, but they're not usually active. But we see a lot of kids under the age of 18 who are formerly minors, which is why we focus on this. Again, we get back to the difficulty of definition. At what point does somebody become a gang member? How do we define that? This isn't a formal institution with applications and criteria, right? There is criteria, but it's very loose and it's very fluid depending on the gang. It's hard to distinguish between people who just hang around gangs. Are they a part of the gang, or are they just wannabes and hangers on? Um, so how do we determine that? We usually go with certain criteria, and that includes self-proclamation. So people who legitimately say, I am a member of MS-13 or I am a member of fill in the blank gang. A presence of gang tattoos. So tattoos with gang paraphernalia specific to one specific gang, on anywhere on their body. And then wearing gang colors. That is the criteria we usually use to determine formal gang affiliation. So this begs the question, why do kids join gangs? And there's several reasons why this happens, several driving factors. The really big one is going to be family. Usually that there is a lack of a familial presence, that one parent or both parents are out of the picture. One parent might still be in the picture. But as a single parent and a single-headed household, they have to work multiple jobs to provide financially, so they're just not there a lot. Incarceration is a big one. So one or both parents being incarcerated. And what happens is these kids are looking for somebody to replace that family. They're looking for a sense of belonging. They're looking for people to protect them, people to love them, care about them, look after them. We also see peer association as a big driving factor, so that if they have friends who are already involved in gangs, they're more likely to get involved in gangs. And then, of course, obtaining money through illegal means, and being able to obtain greater amounts of money than you would, say, at an after-school job, working minimum wage. So, being able to gather more money as a young person, selling drugs, moving illegal firearms, things of that nature. And then finally, another driving factor is protection from other gangs. That usually you don't have one gang and that's it in a given area. You have multiple gangs, and they're usually rivals, and they don't get along, and they engage in violence against one another, or they engage in violence against people who are simply not affiliated with any gang. And joining a gang brings the protection of that gang with you for you from other gangs versus you being on your own trying to fight off a gang by yourself or to manage gang violence as you the individual. So once again, let's get back to our difficult definitions. So how do we define gang-related crime? So if somebody is a member of a gang and they engage in a crime, is it by default, by default, gang-related crime? Or is it just simply a gang member who engaged in crime of their own volition? It gets very dicey. And you might ask, well, so what? What do we care? And that makes it really hard for us to gather information, data, on gang issues to create evidence-driven responses and interventions to managing gangs. So it becomes difficult for us to really define if somebody's involved with a gang. Well, was that gang-driven violence, or did you just get angry at somebody and get into a fight? And by the way, you happen to be affiliated with a gang. So I want you to keep in mind as we go through this that there's a lot of fuzzy edges to all of these definitions, and just sort of keep that in the back of your head as context. So something else I want you to be aware of is that gangs, more and more, which we already said, are trafficking narcotics. They're making money moving large quantities of illegal narcotics. And what they're doing now, and something that's very common, is targeting minors, targeting juveniles, to bring them into the gang and have them be the drug runners, to have them be the mules carrying, delivering, and selling. Why? Because if a minor gets caught, they're going to get a less harsh penalty than if somebody in the gang who's over the age of 18 gets caught. They're going to get a much harsher penalty in the adult system. The juveniles may, if it's their first offense or if it's a nonviolent offense, they might get diverted, they might get probation. They can keep working. They're not going to be incarcerated. But somebody over 18, if they get caught, they're going to be incarcerated. So it keeps their workforce moving and active, because fewer, everybody's going to get popped at some point, statistically speaking. If you're moving drugs, eventually some of your workforce is going to get arrested. But this workforce sticks around longer because they're not going to prison for 10 to 15 years. A really great example, if you ever have the time, is a book called The Cocaine Kids, which is an inside story interview piece of research where somebody um, got to know a guy in his 20s who was still involved in a gang, and he ran kids. He used adolescent minor children to run his drug empire because they were less of a liability, and they were going to get off easier. And it kept him out of prison because he's just organizing and orchestrating. He wasn't actually out running and holding. So good book if you ever get a chance to take a look. There are different types of gangs, so let's define what those are. First, we have hedonistic gangs. These gangs are very infrequently involved in delinquency. They don't engage in violence. They're usually focused on using drugs and partying. We have instrumental gangs, which are primarily involved in burglary, in theft, in auto theft. They don't usually partake in drug trafficking, and they don't engage in violence unless it's a byproduct of, the other crimes that they're committing. They're literally looking for, revenue. They engage as a gang and they engage in crimes for revenue. Then we have predatory gangs, and this is going to be what your knee-jerk reaction, what you typically think of when you hear that word gang. This is what you think of. And these are going to be gangs that are involved in serious violence, that commit violent crimes like robbery. They have a lot of heavy drug use, a lot of heavy drug trafficking, and this is just sort of the archetype of what we all think of when we say the word gang. I want to point out that gangs are very gender specific. Women are not allowed in male gangs, and male members of male gangs would not partake in female gangs. They're not seen as serious or as tough as male gangs. Female gangs are typically the counterpart to the male gang. So members of the male gang will be dating women, or the women in the female gang, they'll be dating their boyfriend, girlfriend, partners, whatever. And they have the female gangs do things like hold narcotics, hold illegal firearms, things of that nature, because they're less likely to be searched than the male gang counterparts. So they tend to operate in, they're separate entities, but they tend to operate as different arms of sort of the same being, right? That it's a faction. Female gangs are a subsection of their male boyfriend counterparts. But what we are seeing, and what we have seen in the past several decades, is that female gangs are on the rise. And when I say female gangs, I mean standalone female gangs. So they're not affiliated with a male counterpart. They're not affiliated with boyfriends who are in gangs over here. They literally organize a group of females, and they are just their own standalone gang, operating, for their own profit, not answering to anybody else, not working as a mule for another larger male group, that they are moving forward and gaining autonomy in the gang world. So I want you to know that gangs primarily communicate through things like graffiti. You'll see tagging all over inner cities. It's not just random tagging. Typically, they're tagging their signs, and it's marking territory, or they're going into another gang's territory and leaving their tag in another gang's territory is meant as a challenge. Hand signs are another method of communication that people will throw hand signs to identify what gang they are affiliated with. Hand signs can get really dicey and dangerous because if you throw hand signs from your gang to somebody and they're in another gang or they're in a rival gang, typically we usually see some violence erupt shortly thereafter. And clothing is also a way of communicating gang affiliation. We go back to sort of the original, you know, example with the Bloods and the Crips, that the Bloods were obviously red. They always wore red in some capacity and lots of it, and the Crips wore blue. And it was a way of distinguishing gang affiliation. So let's talk about gang response. What do we do to combat gang-related crime and violence? So one of the first things we can do is community organization. So we want to modify community relationships and resources so that there are other places for kids to go beyond gang affiliation. We want to have pro-social, legal, safe environments and outlets where kids can go after school when mom or dad are still working that does not involve a bunch of kids who are engaging in violent crime and drug trafficking. We also want to provide opportunities. So the more opportunities a local area has for young people, again, the less enticing gang affiliation is. And when we say opportunities, we mean things like job training, the ability to get an after-school job, the ability to play after-school sports or be involved in, some sort of music venture, with band or what have you. There's organizational change, and that is much more formal. So organizational change is going to be when the law enforcement agency in the area is going to devote a specific section of their division to gang intervention and to gang response. So that's going to be all those officers do. They're going to spend their time gathering intelligence on the gangs, who's who in the gang, what everybody's job is in the gang, what kind of violence and crime they have been engaged in, what we think they're currently engaged in. And that entire organizational change through law enforcement is going to focus on intervening and trying to dismantle the gang. There's also social outreach, so outreach to gang members that offers them things like drug treatment and counseling. Obviously, a lot of the people who are involved in gangs are troubled and have problems that have gone unmet and untreated. So social intervention is an option. And getting back to my previous example with organizational change, it's just going to be suppression. And suppression is the desired outcome of all that organizational change that law enforcement engages in. Suppression meaning that it's formal social control, we make arrests and we incarcerate and we suppress the ability for the gangs to continue and for the gangs to proliferate. Gang sweeps are a common form of suppression. You've probably heard of them. Like I said, they will utilize local surveillance and intelligence gathering. They'll make their patrols more aggressive just so they have a greater presence in a given area, which will frequently cause gang activity to disperse to other areas that have lower rates of patrol. And it's how they identify known gang members. There have also been prosecutorial efforts to manage gangs, and they've gotten very creative with this in that they've started using the RICO statute. For those of you who aren't familiar, the RICO statute, it stands for Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act. And this was first developed in the late 1970s, and it was developed specifically to battle organized crime, very specifically to battle the Italian mafia. It was meant to dismantle that. And what it is it's this broad net of offenses that if any of these offenses are committed, it is now constitutes a method of organized crime, and you fall under the RICO statutes. And it really just widens the net, the government's net, and the ability to take a group like a gang that's very big, where there's a lot of crime that's happening. And instead of having to catch you in the act or catch you here or there, there's just a lot of different statutes that are involved in violating RICO. And if anybody in your organization is involved in violating RICO, they can begin to dismantle the whole organization. So, for example, if any gang member had any, they don't physically have to be present, is what I'm saying. So we start treating gangs like an organized criminal enterprise. You don't have to be present for the drug trafficking to get in trouble for the drug trafficking, so long as you are a part of the organization that engages in the drug trafficking. That's what RICO laws allow us to do, is you don't have to be there. We don't have to catch you red-handed in the act, but you are a part of the larger organization that is engaging in this. And therefore, we can prosecute you to the same extent that we can for the people who were physically there, caught red-handed with narcotics on their person. There's also a response that's gaining traction, and it's called nuisance abatement. And this is a way that, again, where prosecutors got very creative, and this is managing gangs through the civil process. So what they will do is have a gang declared a public nuisance, which is a civil offense. So we're stepping away from the criminal court here for a second. We're going into the civil court. And if you are declared a public nuisance, then the judge will pursue a court order that is requesting an abatement process. And that word abatement means to lessen, to minimize. And it will order all the members of that gang to desist in their delinquent behaviors. And if one member of the gang disobeys, the entire gang is then going to be classified as a nuisance. Each member of the gang will then be given a lawful order that restricts their behavior. So, and it will get very specific. So you cannot wear your gang colors. You cannot possess a cell phone. You cannot associate with other known gang affiliates. They'll give out those orders, and the minute one person breaks those orders or violates those orders, they are now violating the court order that was issued by the judge, and they can be incarcerated. So this really nuisance abatement, which, you know, it's born in the civil court, but it has the ability to, you know, once it's born, it has arms that reach to the criminal court if continued offenses continue to occur. So things like common abatements are going to be things like gang fighting, possessing weapons, you know, tagging and graffiti, possessing gang-related items. And this is just a creative workaround law that has given prosecutors bigger muscles, if you will, in terms of fighting gang-related violence and crime.